The materials you'll need for this project are cardboard, an X-Acto knife, a box cutter, a pen or pencil, a hot glue gun, gloss white spray paint, colonial red spray paint, satin gray primer, a putty knife, flexible spackle, clear plastic, a disposable cup, some black paint, any paint brushes, paper towels, and some thin cardboard. The first thing I did when I made this helmet is I made the dome. So I started with a between 22 to 23 inch ring, and then from that I glued little strips on it to start making a concave shape that would fit over my head, and then once it looked right I would glue it on. And I did a cross beam technique to where you do one beam in the middle and then two beams on the front and back. The first time I glued it on, it looked a little bit wonky, so I just cut it off and then re-glued it, and then it looked fine. So now I have the basic skeleton of the helmet done, and next I'm going to fill in these pieces just with another technique that I'll show you. The technique for filling in the four corners of the dome is really easy. You only need 3 pieces of cardboard per corner, and you just cut one little sliver and you attach that from the middle of the corner to the middle of the top corner, and then you glue that on, and then you just fill in those 2 side gap pieces. It's a really simple technique, and I have used this on many of my helmets. To find out how big that corner shape is, I put a piece of cardboard over it, and then I go to the inside and I trace out that shape, and then once I have the good shape, I glue it in. Then I just repeated that step for all 4 corners of the helmet. I also made sure to try to keep the dome as smooth as possible, so any of those side pieces would be just the right size and they wouldn't be bulging out, because that has happened in some of my past helmets. So that is half of the dome finished, so it's nice and filled in. I will eventually cover this up with spackle just to get it nice and smooth. So now I just need to fill in the front. And when I traced out those little filler pieces on the sides, on the inside of the helmet, I made sure to cut outside of the line, not on the inside of the line or on the line, so it would have a perfect fit. You can see here that I just attach one piece and then pin it up to the top corner, make sure it has enough curve, and then I would just go to the inside, trace it, and then cut out that shape and then glue it on to where it would look nice and smooth. And now that I'm done with the helmet, it's a little bit small, so I would recommend making your dome bigger than you think you'll need it, because on this helmet, the cheek pieces push in fairly far, and that makes it hard to get my helmet on. So if you're gonna make this, just make your dome a little bit bigger, and you'll thank yourself in the end. The dome I showed you in this video is different from this video, as it is another method. It's a bit more complex, but it looks a lot nicer in the finished product. I have used this dome pattern on most of my helmets. I have just modified it a little bit for the ARF Trooper helmet, making it pointed in the back. So this is a very fundamental piece that you can use for any helmet that you want to make. And there is the finished dome. So now I'm going to cut the little channel out of the back, and then I'll work on the faceplate. I used a really good reference image to find out how far forward to cut out the channel, and it's actually further forward than I would have done it if I wasn't looking at a reference image. So just make sure that you can get a really nice reference image for this project, and it'll really help. So now that I have the channel cut out the back, I'm just going to put another piece of cardboard in on that. So now that the channel is finished, I'm going to work on the faceplate. Then, after that, I'll move on to the sides. I'll be honest, this is probably the hardest part of the project because it's really hard to get a nice visor piece shape that actually looks accurate. So I just looked at a picture and I did my best. I did glue on the frown attachment pieces, but I ended up cutting those off after I traced it out onto the cardboard. But just, again, this reference image will really help making this piece. Here is my template finished, and I'm going to go trace it out on some cardboard. After I traced it out on the cardboard, I started working on cutting out the visor piece. And if you wanted your helmet to have more structural support, then you could leave that in and cut it out at the very end. But I didn't think of that, so I just cut a little support piece to glue onto the inside. I also found out that my visor piece was a little bit too thin and too long, so I just added some filler pieces and I trimmed and cut in a little bit out of areas just to get the shape looking right. As you can see here, I'm starting to work on the chin piece, but I ended up doing that later just because I didn't know how to do it at this point. So I started working on the side pieces, and with those, I just looked at the image and I traced it out on the sides, and then I poked a little hole in the middle, and then I made that hole travel through all of the pieces, and then in the middle piece, I would cut out a little channel so I could have attachments slide in there and then pull them out whenever you wanted to. I made a total of 6 side pieces, 3 for each side, and the middle piece is sandwiched in between 2 regular pieces, so the channel is in the middle. These pieces are glued on just after the channel on the back starts. So now I have the side pieces on, so then I'm going to trim them down at an angle and then work on the pieces that go in there. So now I'm getting back to working on the frown, so I glued on some triangles at the very base of the visor piece, and then I cut a triangle out of some cardboard and just tried to get a nice angular shape on this. And I ended up just using a giant piece of cardboard and I held it in there and then I glued the edges onto that, and then I just looked at the shape and I cut out a kind of rounded triangle shape that would just fit in that gap and have a nice angle facing forward. This took me a while, but I'm really happy with how it looks now. After I had the base frown piece done, I took another piece of cardboard and laid it over it to get the detail piece for the main detail of the frown. So there is the very front done. So now I need to work on the cheeks and trim these down. Where the inside of the visor piece was, I just added a little 1/2 inch border all the way around that so the cheek piece could be inset. After I had that done, I just laid the cheek piece on it and then I traced it out and then glued it on. And then I repeated that for the other side. And then for the lower cheek piece, I held up another piece of cardboard and I traced that out, and it had kind of a rounded shape at the top so it could be flat and then also be rounded at the top. Then I just glued that on both sides. Okay, so there are the side compartments. So now I'm gonna fill in the back and then I'll do the fin on the top. If you look at a good reference image, you'll see that there's a little border at the very bottom. So I started adding this in here, but then after I finished the back, I also added it on there. And then I also forgot that the back channel piece has a V dip in it, so I ended up cutting out a little chunk of that lower back piece, and then I just added a V-shaped piece of cardboard onto there so the sides would glue flush on top of that. Then I just took pieces of cardboard and glued them on behind the ear pieces, and then I just folded them over and traced out a triangle shape on them, and then I cut that out and glued it on so it would have a nice dip. Then I started working on the trim piece at the back, and I just held up pieces of cardboard onto it and traced out the shape, and then once I was happy with it, I just glued it on, and then I just filled in that one last piece at the back. So now that I have the whole back filled in, minus the little circle there, all I have to do is do the fin and then the Macrobinoculars. If you want to make a commando helmet from Star Wars The Clone Wars, then you could stop here, but I wanted to make a Phase 1 Clone Trooper helmet, so I just traced out the shape of the curve of the helmet, and then I made the fin and made sure that it looked flat on the top, and then I traced that out again for both sides, and then I glued it on, and then I put a thin piece of cardboard in between them just to make the layers a little bit smoother. I also wrapped that back piece of cardboard down and under so it would be able to cover up the underside. So this is the finished fin, so now I'm just going to work on the Macrobinoculars. For the Macrobinoculars, I just cut out a shape that I was happy with, and then I poked a hole in the center of the back just so it could pivot, and then I started working on the middle. So this is the side piece for the Macrobinocular. This is my template piece, so now I'm going to trace it out twice. After I had both of those pieces cut out and laid on the helmet, I measured the gap in between them, and it was just about 7 inches, so I traced that out and then made a little channel out of the middle of that, and then I glued that on to hold them together. And then I started working on the rounded piece that would curve around the helmet, and then once I got the shape that I was happy with, I just glued it onto the Macrobinoculars. Then for the gap piece that goes in between that, I just put another square of cardboard on that and just rounded off the corners and cut them out, and then I glued that on as well. Then I worked on the bottom, which is basically the same thing as the top, just with a little channel cut out of it. So those are the finished Macrobinoculars, and now I'm going to trim down these pegs so I can put a little detail over them so you won't notice them, but then you can pull them off and then take the Macrobinoculars out, but they can pivot up like that, and then they can go down like that, and they won't come off unless if you pull out both pins. So now I'll just add the details onto these pins. So here I am from the future, and I'll just give you a better shot of these pegs. So it's just a little circle of cardboard with a little barbecue skewer at the end. So once you stick it in to the helmet, the Macrobinoculars will not come out. For the pegs, I cut out about 1/2 inch of barbecue skewer, and then I glued that to a circle that I traced from the inside diameter of a tape roll, and that was a perfect shape. So then I just poked a hole all the way through. So there I have the caps stuck on for the Macrobinoculars. So it's just a little bit of design, and you can still flip them up. And then once you want to take them off, you just pull the pins out, slide the goggles off, and then stick the pins back in. There we go. Now it's time to fill and sand and fill and sand and then paint. If you watched my Iron Man Mark 85 helmet tutorial, I did a similar process to this helmet, except I used a little bit of warm water just to smoothen it out after I had applied it. This worked great. I only had to do 2 coats instead of my 3 or 4 that I did on my Iron Man Mark 85 helmet. Now, while I was waiting for the helmet to dry, I painted the Macrobinoculars. So I painted the very fronts black, and then I masked them off, and then I painted the rest of it colonial red to give it a nice finish. And then I waited for the paint to dry, and then once it was dry, I dry brushed a little bit of silver on all the exposed edges that I would think would be weathered in actual battle. So now I'm done weathering the Macrobinoculars, and now the Macrobinoculars are complete, so I don't know if you can see that, but there's some weathering on there. So these are now done. Now I just need to go outside and sand. What I did different about this helmet when it came to sanding is I tried making some sanding blocks. You can buy these online, but I didn't want to wait for them to arrive, so I just glued 2 pieces of cardboard together in a rectangle, and then I glued a piece of foam on top of that just to give it a little bit of form and it could compress into small areas, and then I just sanded over all of the gaps in the helmet. Then when I was done sanding, I sprayed it down with an air compressor just to get all the dust off, and then I filled again, and then sanded again, and then I primed. And when it came to priming, I just gave it all a nice even coat to cover all of the surfaces and fill in any tiny gaps. Looking at the helmet after I primed it, it looks like I don't need to sand it anymore, so now I'm gonna paint it with some gloss white. Now that I have masked the back, I'm gonna go paint the helmet with some gloss white. I painted the bottom first because that's what's going to be sitting down, so I could get a clear shot at everything else. So I did the bottom, and then I painted everything else. And remember, you don't need to paint over the masking tape because you're just gonna be peeling that paint off anyways. Now that I've got the frown masked off, I'm going to paint it gloss black. So now that I have the frown painted in, and I have this little detail black, and also back here I have the detail glued on, now I can work on the visor. So I have my visor template piece here, so I'm just going to go trace this out on some plastic, and then color it in with a Sharpie. Now that the visor's in place, I just need to weather the helmet. And I recently put out a video on how to weather, so I'm not going to go over it in this video. So if you want to learn how to weather, just check out that video. So I'll see you guys when the helmet is finished. This project was really fun to work on, and I highly recommend that you do it as well. It was a pretty complex project, but I still liked it, and it was a very fun process. The next project I'll be working on is Phase 1 Clone Trooper Armor. This has been RGR Productions, signing off till next time.